Howdy, folks. Finally getting around to reading Hatchet. I know if you're in Miss Burl's class and you're listening, you might be a little behind. I did a little Lego recap video of what's happened so far. And so the last thing that happened with Brian was Brian had a porcupine get into his little hut that he's made, and it messed up his leg pretty good. And he had this dream about his dad and Terry, and he's trying to figure out what the dream meant. All right, so I'm going to pick up where I left off. In the initial segment of his dream, his father was standing at the side of the living room looking at him, and it was clear from his expression that he was trying to tell Brian something. His lips moved, but there was no sound, not even a whisper. He waved his hands at Brian, made gestures in front of his face, as if he were scratching something, and he worked to make a word with his mouth, but Brian could not see it. Then the lips made a shape, but no sound came. Brian could not make it out, could not understand it, and he wanted to so badly. It was so important to understand his father, to know what he was saying. He was trying to help, trying so hard, and when Brian couldn't understand, he looked cross. The word cross means mad. So his dad looks mad because Brian isn't understanding what he's saying. The way he did when Brian asked questions more than once, and he faded. Brian's father faded into a fog place Brian could not see, and the dream was almost over, or it seemed to be, when Terry came. He was not gesturing to Brian, but he was sitting in the park at a bench looking at a barbecue pit, and for a time nothing happened. Then he got up and he poured some charcoal from a bag into the cooker, and then some starter fluid, and he took a flick type lighter and lit the fluid. When it was burning and the charcoal was last getting hot, he turned, noticing Brian for the first time in the dream. He turned and he smiled, and he pointed at the fire as if to say, "See? Fire." But it meant nothing to Brian except that he wished he had a fire. He saw a grocery sack on the table next to Terry. Brian thought it must contain hot dogs and chips and mustard. And he could think only of food, but Terry shook his head and he pointed again to the fire. And twice more he pointed to the fire. Made Brian see the flames, and Brian felt his frustration and anger rise, and he thought, all right, I see the fire, but so what? I don't have a fire. I know about fire. I know I needed a fire. I know that. His eyes opened, and there was a light in the cave, a gray, dim light of morning. He wiped his mouth, and he tried to move his legs, which had stiffened like wood. There was thirst and hunger, and he ate some raspberries from his jacket. They had spoiled a bit, seemed softer and mushier, but still had a rich sweetness. He crushed the berries against the roof of his mouth, and his tongue drank the sweet juice as it ran down his throat. A flash of metal came and caught his eye, and he saw the hatchet in the sand where he had thrown it at the porcupine in the dark. He scooched up, winced a bit when he bent his stiff leg, and crawled to where the hatchet had laid. He picked it up and examined it, and he saw a chip in the top of the head. The nick wasn't too large, but the hatchet was important to him, was his only tool, and he should not have thrown it. He should keep it in his hand and make a tool of some kind to help push an animal away. Make a staff, he thought, or a lance. And saved the hatchet. Something came then, a thought, as he held the hatchet, something about the dream and his father and Terry, but he couldn't pin it down. Ah! He scrambled out and stood in the morning sun and stretched his back muscles and his sore leg. The hatchet was still in his hand, and he stretched and raised it over his head. It caught the first rays of the morning in the sun. The first faint light hit the silver of the hatchet, and it flashed a brilliant gold in the light, like fire. That is it, he thought. What they were trying to tell me. Fire. The hatchet was the key to it all. When he drew the hatchet at the porcupine in the cave, he missed and he hit the stone wall. It had showered with sparks, a golden shower of sparks in the dark, as golden with fire and the sun was now. The hatchet was the answer. That's what his father and Terry had been trying to tell him. Somehow he could not get the fire from the hatchet. The sparks could, and they would, make a fire. Brian went back into the shelter and studied the wall. It was some form of chalky granite, sandstone, but embedded in it were large pieces of dark stone, a harder and darker stone. It only took him a moment to find where the hatchet had struck. The steel had nicked into the edge of one of the darker stone pieces. Brian turned his head backwards so he would strike the flat near of the hatchet and hit the back rock gently. Too gently, and nothing happened. He struck harder, a glancing blow, and 2 or 3 weak sparks skipped off the rock and died immediately. He swung harder, held the hatchet so it would hit a longer sliding blow, and the black rock exploded in fire. Sparks flew so heavily that several of them skittered and jumped off the sand beneath the rock. And he smiled, and he struck again and again. There could be fire here, he thought. I will have a fire here, he thought. Struck again. I will have fire from the hatchet. Chapter 9. Brian found it was a long way from sparks to fire. Clearly, there had to be something from the sparks to ignite, some kind of tinder or kindling, but what? He brought some dry grass. He tapped sparks into it. He watched them die. He tried small twigs, breaking them into little pieces, but that was worse than grass. Then he tried a combination of 2, grass and twigs. Nothing. He had no trouble getting sparks, but the tiny bits of hot stone or metal, he couldn't tell which they were, just sputtered and died. He needed something finer, something soft, fine, and fluffy to catch the bits of fire. Shredded paper would be nice, but he didn't have any paper. So close he laid aloud, so close. He said aloud, sorry. He put the hatchet back in his belt and went out of the shelter, limping on his sore leg. There had to be something, had to be. Man made fire. There had fire. They've had been fire for thousands of years, millions of years. There had to be a way. He dug into his pockets and he found the $20 bill in his wallet. Paper. Worthless paper out here. But if he could get a fire going, he ripped the 20 into pieces, made a pile of pieces, and he hit it with some sparks. Nothing happened. They just wouldn't take the sparks. But there had to be a way, some way to do it. Not 20 feet to his right, leaned out over the water, were birches. And he stood looking at them full half a minute before they registered in his mind. They were a beautiful white, with bark like clean, slightly speckled paper. Paper! He moved to the trees. Where the bark was peeling from the trunks, it lifted in tiny tendrils, almost fluffs. Brian plucked some of those loose, rolled them in with his fingers. They seemed flammable, dry, and nearly powdery. He put and twisted bits of trees, packing them into his hand while he picked them up with the other, picking and gathering until he had a wad close to the size of a baseball. Then he went back into the shelter and arranged the ball of birch bark peelings at the base of the black rock. As an afterthought, he in threw in the remains of the $20 bill. He struck, and a stream of sparks fell into the bark and quickly died. But this time one spark fell on one of the small hairs of dry bark, almost a thread of bark, and seemed to glow a bit brighter before it died. The material had to be finer. There had to be a soft and incredibly fine nest for the sparks. I must make a home for the sparks, he thought, a perfect home where they won't stay. They won't make a fire. He started ripping the bark using his fingernails at first, and when that didn't work, he used the sharp edge of the hatchet, cutting the bark into slivers, hairs so fine they were almost not there. It was painstaking work, slow work, and he stayed with it for over 2 hours. Twice he stopped for a handful of berries, and once to go to the lake for a drink. Then back to work, the sun on his back, until, at last, he had a ball of fluff as big as a grapefruit, dry birch bark fluff. He positioned his spark nest as he as he thought as he thought of it, and as at the base of the rock, and his thumb to make a small depression in the middle, and slammed the back of the hatchet down across the black rock. A cloud of sparks rained down, most of them hissing and missing the nest, but some, perhaps 30 or so, hit the depression, and those 6 or 7 found fuel and grew, smoldered, caused the bark to take on the red glow. Then they went out. Close, he was close. He repositioned the nest, made new and smaller dent with his thumb, and struck again. More sparks, a slight glow, then nothing. It's me, he thought, doing something wrong. I do not know this. A cave dweller would have had a fire by now. A Cro-Magnon man would have a fire by now. But I don't know this. I don't know how to make fire. Maybe not enough sparks. He settled the nest in place once more and hit the rock with a series of blows. As fast as he could, the sparks glowed like a golden waterfall. At first they seemed to take. There were many sparks that found life and took briefly, but then they all died. They starved. He leaned back. They, they're all like me. They're starving. It wasn't quite, quite as good as he thought. There were plenty of sparks, but they needed more. I would kill, he thought suddenly, for a book of matches. Just one book. Just one match. I would kill. What makes fire? He thought, back to school, to all those science classes. Had he ever learned what made a fire? Did a teacher ever stand up and say, "This is what makes a fire"? He shook his head. He tried to focus his thoughts. What did it take? You have to make fuel, he thought. And he had that. The bark was the fuel. Oxygen. There had to be air. He needed to add air. He had to fan it. He had to blow on it. He made the nest again, held the hatchet backwards, tensed, and struck 4 quick blows. Sparks came down, and he leaned forward as fast as he could, and he blew. Too hard. There was a bright, almost intense glow. Then it was gone. He had blown it out. Another set of sparks. More sparks. He leaned and he blew, but gently this time, holding back and aiming the stream of sparks with his mouth to hit the brightest spot. 5 or 6 sparks had fallen in the tight mass of bark hair, and Brian centered his effort there. The sparks grew with the gentle breath. The red glow moved from sparks themselves into the bark, moved and grew, and became worms, glowing red worms that crawled up the bark hairs and caught other threads of bark, and grew until there was a pocket of red as big as a quarter, a growing red coal of heat. And when he ran out of breath and paused to inhale, the red ball suddenly burst into flame. "Fire!" he yelled. "I've got fire! I've got it! I've got it! I've got it!" But the flames were thick and oily and burning fast, consuming the ball of bark as fast as if it were gasoline. He had to feed the flames, keep them going. Working as fast as he could, he carefully placed the dry grass and wood pieces he had tried at first on top of the bark, as was gratified to see them take. But they would go fast. He needed more and more. He could not let the flames go out. He ran from the shelter to the pines, and he started breaking off the low, dead, small limbs. These he threw in the shelter, went back for more, threw those in, squatted to break and feed the flames. When the small wood was going, well, he went out and he found larger wood, and did not relax until that was going. Then he leaned back against the wood brace of the door, opening, and he smiled. "I have a friend," he thought. "I have a friend now. A hungry friend, but a good one. I have a friend named Fire. Hello, Fire." So you think about that. He considers the fire his friend. So a fire provides a lot of things when you're out in the wild. It provides food, like a means to cook your food. It provides warmth. So this is a big deal, and he made it himself. The curve of the rock back made an almost perfect drawing flue that carried the smoke up through the cracks of the roof, but held the heat. If he kept the fire small, it would be perfect and would keep anything like the porcupine from coming through the door again. A friend and a guard, he thought. So much from a little spark. A friend and a guard from a tiny spark. He looked around and wished he had somebody to tell this thing, to show this thing he had done, but there was nobody. Nothing but the trees and the sun and the breeze and the lake. Nobody. And he thought, rolling thoughts, with the smoke curling up over his head and the smile still half on his face, he thought, I wonder what they're doing now. I wonder what my father's doing now. I wonder what my mother's doing now. I wonder if she's with him. Chapter 10. He could not at first leave the fire. It was so precious to him. So he closed so close and sweet a thing, the yellow and the red flames brightening the darker interior of the shelter, the happy crackle of the dry wood as it burned, that he could not leave it. He went to the trees and brought in as many dead limbs as he could chop off and carry, and when he had a large pile of them, he sat near the fire, though it was getting into the warmer middle part of the day, and he was hot, and he broke them into small pieces and fed the fire. I will not let you go out, he said to himself, to the flames, not ever. And so he sat through a long part of the day, keeping the flames even, eating from his stock of raspberries, leaving to drink from the lake when he was thirsty. In the afternoon, towards the evening, his face smoke smeared and his skin red from the heat, he finally began to think ahead to what he needed to do. He would need a large woodpile to get through the night. It would be almost impossible to find wood in the dark, so he had to have it all in cut and stacked before the sun went down. Brian made certain the fire was banked with new wood, and he went out of the shelter and searched for good fuel supply. Up the hill from the campsite, the same windstorm that left him a place to land the plane had that only been 3 or 4 days ago, had dropped 3 large white pines across each other. They were dead now, dry and filled with weathered, dry, dead limbs. Enough for many days. He chopped and he broke, and he carried wood back to the camp, stacking the pieces under the overhang until he had what he thought to be an enormous pile, as high as his head and 6 feet across the base. Between trips, he added small pieces to the fire to keep it going, and on one of the trips to get wood, he noticed an added advantage of the fire. When he was in the shade of the trees, breaking limbs, the mosquitoes swarmed on him, as usual, but when he came to the fire, or just near the shelter, where the smoke eddied and swirled, the insects were gone. It was a wonderful discovery. The mosquitoes had nearly driven him mad, and the thought of being rid of them lifted his spirits. On another trip, he looked back and he saw that the smoke curling up through the trees and realized for the first time that he now had a means to make a signal. He could carry a burning stick and build a signal and perhaps attract attention, which meant more wood, and still more wood. There did not seem to be an end to the wood he would need, and he spent all the rest of the afternoon into dusk making wood trips. At dark he settled in again for the night next to the fire with the stack of short pieces ready to put on, and he ate the rest of his raspberries. During all the work of the day his leg had loosened, but it still ached a bit, and he rubbed it and watched the fire and thought for the first time since the crash that he might be getting a handle on things, might be starting to do something other than just sit. He was out of food, but he could look tomorrow, and he could build a signal fire tomorrow and get more wood tomorrow. The fire cut the night coolness and settled him back into sleep. Thinking of tomorrow, he kept hard he slept hard and wasn't sure what awakened him, but his eyes came open and he stared into the darkness. The fire had burned down and looked out, but he he stirred with a piece of wood and found a bed of coals still glowing hot and red. With small pieces of wood and carefully blowing, soon the blaze was going again. It had been close. He had to be sure to try and sleep in short intervals so he could keep the fire going, and he tried to think of a way to regulate his sleep, but it made him sleepy to think about it. And he was just going under again when he heard the sound outside. It was not unlike the sound of a porcupine, something's slithering and being dragged across the sand. But when he looked out the door opening into the dark to see anything, he saw nothing. Whatever it was stopped making the sound in a few moments, and he thought he heard something sloshing into the water at the shoreline. But he had the fire now and plenty of wood, so he wasn't as worried as he had been the night before. He dozed, slept for a time, awakened again just at dawn, gray light, and added wood to the still smoking fire before standing outside and stretching. Standing with his arms stretched out, his head and the tight knot of hunger in his stomach, he looked towards the lake, and he saw tracks. They were strange. A main center line up from the lake in the sand, and claw marks to the side, leading to a small pile of sand, then going back down to the water. He walked over, squatted near them, studied them, tried to make sense of them. Whatever had made the tracks had some kind of flat, dragging bottom in the middle and was apparently pushing along by the legs that struck out to the side, up from the water to a small pile of sand, then back down into the water. Some animal, some kind of water animal that came up to the sand to do what? To do something with the sand, to play and make a pile in the sand. He smiled. City boy, he thought. Oh, you city boy, with your city ways. He made a mirror in his mind, a mirror of himself, and saw how he must look. A city boy, with your city ways, sitting in the sand, trying to read the tracks, and not knowing, not understanding. Why would anything wild come up from the water to play in the sand? Not that way. Animals weren't that way. They didn't waste time like that. It had come up from the water for a reason, a good reason, and he must try to understand the reason. He must change to fully understand the reason by himself, or he would not make it. It had come up from the water for a reason, and that reason, he thought, squatting, the reason had to do with the pile of sand. He brushed the top off gently with his hand, but found only damp sand. Still, there must be a reason, and he carefully kept scraping and digging until, about 4 inches down, he suddenly came into a small chamber. In the cool, damp sand, there lay eggs, many eggs, almost perfectly round eggs the size of a table tennis ball, and he laughed, then because he knew. It had been a turtle. He had seen a show on television about sea turtles that came up onto the beach and laid their eggs in the sand. There must be freshwater lake turtles that did the same thing. Maybe snapping turtles. He had heard of snapping turtles. They became fairly large, he thought. It must have been a snapper that came up in the night when he heard the noise that awakened him. She must have come then and laid her eggs. Food. More than eggs, more than knowledge, more than anything, this was food. His stomach tightened and it rolled and it made the noise as he looked at the eggs, as if his stomach belonged to somebody else, or had seen the eggs with his own eyes, and the demanding food, the hunger always there, had been somewhat controlled and dormant when there was nothing to eat, but with the eggs came the screaming to eat. His whole body craved food with such an intensity that it quickened his breath. He reached into the nest. He pulled the egg out, one at a time. There were 17 of them, each as round as a ball and as white. They had leathery shells that gave instead of breaking when they squeezed them. When he had them heaped on the sand in a pyramid, he had never felt so rich, somehow, suddenly realizing that he did not know how to eat them. He had a fire, but he had no way to cook them, no container, and he had never thought of eating a raw egg. He had an uncle named Carter, his father's brother, who always put an egg in a glass of milk and drank it in the morning. Brian had watched him do it once, just once, and when the runny part of the white left the glass and went into his uncle's mouth and down the throat in a single gulp, Brian almost lost everything he had eaten ever. Still, he thought, still, as his stomach moved towards the backbone, he became less and less fussy. Some natives in the world ate grasshoppers and ants, and if they could do that, he could get a raw egg down. He picked one up. He tried to break the shell and found it surprisingly tough. Finally, using the hatchet, he sharpened a stick and poked a hole in the egg. He widened the hole with his finger. He looked inside. Just an egg. It had a dark yellow yolk and not so much white, so he thought. There would be it's just an egg. It's food. Just an egg he had to eat. He had to eat it raw. He looked out across the lake. He brought the egg to his mouth. He closed his eyes. He sucked and he squeezed the egg at the same time, and he swallowed as fast as he could. Yuck! It was greasy, almost oily taste, but it was still an egg. His throat tried to throw it back up. His whole body seemed to convulse with it, but his stomach took it. It held it, and it demanded more. The second egg was easier, and by the third one, he had no trouble at all. It just slid down. He ate 6 of them, could have easily eaten all of them and not been full, but a part of him said to hold back, save the rest. He could not believe the hunger. The eggs had awakened it fully, roaring so that it tore in him. After the 6th egg, he ripped the shell open and he licked the inside clean. Then he went back and ripped the other 5 open and licked them out as well, and wondered if he could eat the shells. There must be some food value in them, but when he tried, they were too leathery to chew, and he couldn't get them down. He stood away from the eggs for a moment, literally stood, and turned away so he could not see them. If he looked at them, he would have to eat more. He stored them in the shelter and eat only one a day. He fought the hunger down again, controlled it. He would take them now and store them and save them and eat one a day, and he realized as he thought it, that he had forgotten that they might come. The searchers, surely they would come before he could eat all the eggs at one a day. He had forgotten to think about them, and that wasn't good. He had to keep thinking of them because if he forgotten them and did not think of them, they might forget about him. And he had to keep hoping. He had to keep hoping. All right, so I'm going to be posting some questions. We are now on chapter 11, and I'll read some more of that and post that as well. I'm hoping you're enjoying it. I know this is a long video, 30 minutes, but feel free to pause it and come back. I'll be once we get a little further along, I'll try to make another Lego video for you. All right, guys, I'll be posting some other stuff. Enjoy.